Welcome History 141 class to the virtual office hours. Professor Fia here. Megan Piet is here behind the camera. And today we want to talk a little bit about our lecture that Professor Snyder actually gave in class this time around on the Federalists. Remember, the Constitution establishes a new strong federal government. And that means we're going to have a new executive branch. We're going to have a president, a vice president, George Washington, John Adams. But we spent most of our time in class talking about the sort of economic vision that the Federalists have for the United States. And when we think about that economic vision, we have to think about the Secretary of the Treasury, the first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and how he wanted the United States to move forward in the wake of the United States Constitution. Hamilton is very interested in modeling his views of government as closely as he can on the British. Now again, he can't have a king, even though he does at one point try to make a pitch to have a king in America. But he's very conservative in that sense, very traditional. He wants to model the United States government after the British because, after all, the British is a very liberty-loving country. Not as sort of liberty-loving as people like Tom Paine or maybe Thomas Jefferson, as we'll see in a second, would like it to be. But Britain is his model. At the same time, he also wants to create an independent nation. Now again, in 1776, of course, the political break from England, we have an independent country in America. But Alexander Hamilton also sees independence from Great Britain and really independence from the rest of the world in economic terms. What might it look like for the United States to be independent, or I should say not dependent, upon other countries for their livelihood and particularly their manufactured goods? So how do we get the United States out of the economic disaster of the 1780s under the Articles of Confederation, in which all the states had the power, and bring some economic centralization, if you will, to the government? And he proposes several things that Professor Snyder talked about in class. First thing he has to do is he has to figure out some way to relieve the debt that Americans owe to Britain and or I should say to other countries. And he does this, as we talked about, through the sale of these government bonds. He establishes a national debt, a very small one, I might add, in order to justify taxing the people. Here he runs into some problems because of his excise tax and how it affects the whiskey growers, the whiskey producers out in western Pennsylvania and elsewhere. They revolt. They see this taxation scheme that Hamilton puts in place to stabilize the government as little more than another form of tyranny, another taxation scheme, not unlike the taxation scheme that the British had put forth on the colonies during the 1760s and early 1770s. But nevertheless, Hamilton moves forward with this plan. He also relieves the debt of the states as well, which is a clear model of how this Constitution is going to work. The federal government relieves the debts of the states, of course, being somewhat now economically subordinate to the federal government. And then, of course, we have that compromise we talked about, which ultimately results in the new capital, Washington, D.C. The other big issue in Hamilton's plan is manufacturing. Right? We need to manufacture our own goods so we are no longer dependent upon England and other countries. Remember, during the 1780s, there was a very unbalanced trade relationship as Britain was pouring in goods into the United States, and the United States was not selling goods to Britain, or Britain wasn't buying goods from the United States anymore. So Hamilton wants to fix that by establishing manufacturing. We'll produce our own goods. And this is going to require manufacturing centers, maybe even cities. It's going to require an immigrant labor force to work in these cities so that we can build the economic strength of the country. And then finally, to get us on good economic footing, he proposes a national bank. A national bank that will obviously collect revenues that are going to come from his taxation plan, but it will also then stimulate the economy by loaning money to wealthy investors or businessmen in order to keep the capitalist economy, or what will become the capitalist economy, moving. So Hamilton, in many ways, whether you like his policies or not, he sees the future. he is probably more responsible than anyone for the direction that the United States is going to take, especially as we get into the later 19th century and into the 20th century. His vision wins the day. Of course, not everybody agrees with this vision. Thomas Jefferson, who will become his political rival, is going to come up with a very, very different vision, a vision rooted in farming and land and spreading out westward, and creating independent Americans, independence connected directly with land for Jefferson, rather than building these cities where you have all these dependent workers like Hamilton wants to do. Jefferson has a much different sort of agrarian vision, the vision of the yeoman farmer. That is how America will grow, rather than growing industrially. So it's a much more simplistic or simple approach that maybe does not translate into America being a world superpower down the road. And we'll see, Jefferson's idea does get some traction, as we'll see in future lectures. But for the most part, in the long run, it's going to be Hamilton's vision, for good or for bad, that's going to come to dominate American economics and nationalism. So understand Hamilton's vision. We'll talk a little bit about its early success or even its early failure in some ways. But I think it's important for you to be aware of that. So we'll see you next time on the Virtual Office Hours.